deal. Here's the bottom line. Harry and Meghan have become hate figures for much of Britain, never mind the British media, for two reasons. The first is James Baldwin's timeless quote. I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hate so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. And the second reason is that they gave the finger to Fleet Street. And Fleet Street won't accept that. I sometimes wonder whether, if my old man hadn't been made redundant by the Daily Telegraph, I would have been one of the people leading the line of attack on these two. Because when you've got Fleet Street in your blood, when you've got ink in your blood, any attempt to lead your life as if we're not in charge is greeted with absolute fury. Look at what happens if you dare to stand up to the British tabloid media. They will kick you round the room until you're bruised and bloodied, and quite possibly, in the case of the Duchess of Sussex, of course, contemplating the worst possible way out of that level of abuse and unkindness. And yet they carried on. They refused to buckle. They tried to play by the rules. They sought the kind of deal that royals have been securing through the ages in their dealings with Fleet Street. They tried to get a kind of a hiatus, a reprieve, a ceasefire, but they didn't. They didn't get it. The palace, for good or for ill, did not come in on behalf of Prince Harry and his wife and demand that the vampires of Fleet Street stop sucking their blood every morning. So they decided to do everything their own way. They decided to rewrite their own rulebook and live entirely by that. They decided that they would not dance to anybody's tune but their own. They are not perfect. They are not infallible. Some of the stuff they do is a little bit silly, but my goodness me, they're brave. Imagine that. Imagine growing up in that goldfish bowl and deciding that you're going to smash the glass and see whether or not you can survive. That's what they can never be forgiven for. And nobody understands this better than the Fleet Street machine that needs the royal family just as much as the royal family needs the Fleet Street machine. That relationship is not parasitic, as I used to think. It's symbiotic. There are lines that will never be crossed. And if the unexpected or the unprecedented happens, then the reaction will be negotiated. How can we possibly live in a land where the late Queen's second son, Andrew Windsor, is treated more gently and more quietly, calmly, insert whatever adverb you prefer, than her youngest grandson, or rather the King's youngest son, the current King's youngest son? How can we possibly live in a land where Andrew Windsor is talked of in the same breath as Prince Harry? Think about that for a minute. That's been done because of a deal, whether implicit or explicit, between the royal family and the Fourth Estate, the media, the newspapers. You can keep your access. You can come on your tours. We'll answer your questions. But the other lad, he's out of favour now. And his wife, open season. You can do whatever the hell you want with her. You can write what you want, you can say what you want, you can print what you want, you can broadcast whatever you want about her. I know what you're thinking. Didn't exactly end well, where we gave you the same free pass on Harry's mum. But hey-ho, the world has turned. That memory has faded a bit. So open season on Meghan Markle. Write what you want, say what you want, do what you want. So they did. And they continue to do so, which is why even today, the front pages of every newspaper are somehow turning the fact that they are more interesting than his brother and sister-in-law into something of which they are guilty. Netflix trailer steals the spotlight from Wales's. It's absolutely pathetic. Breathtakingly pathetic, actually, that the machine, the war machine of Fleet Street is now so devoid of justification for its bile that they're claiming the release date of a Netflix film is a declaration of war. And do you know what? I hope it is. I hope it is, because if my wife had been treated like his wife has been treated, all bets would be off. If I had gone to my brother and asked him to help me protect my wife from the kind of abuse that Meghan Markle has been exposed to, and that abuse seeps from mainstream media to social media and drips into every corner of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. And my brother had turned around to me and said, yeah, well, there it is. I'd be declaring war. If this was 400 years ago, I'd be raising a flag on Hounslow Heath and contemplating a coup for the crown. But those days are over. The prize today is just PR. The prize today is public image. And here, finally, is the question. It's just envy, isn't it? The whole point of the attacks upon Prince Harry and his wife, whether they're coming from within the palace, on the record, off the record, nowhere near the record, or whether it's coming from Fleet Street, is because they're simply better at everything. They're better at PR. They're more media savvy, they're more articulate, they're more empathetic. Crucially, they're more accomplished. Look at their careers, compare their careers. They're more accomplished and they're more attractive. So here is the real sin of Harry Windsor. And this only occurred to me last night. It's box fresh. I'm going to throw open the phone lines and you can kick it to pieces if you want on 0345 6060973. But the real reason for the hatred, the viciousness, and this astonishing level of abuse is because they make a complete mockery of royalty itself. The idea that he gets the top job and he sits in the sidecar for the rest of his life is absolutely absurd. But we can never ever admit that because it shakes the very foundations of the royal family. So, do you think that the real reason why Prince Harry and his wife have been turned into public enemies numbers 1 and 2 in this country is because...
When commentator James O'Brien recently called out the palace for being accomplices to relentless, embarrassing propaganda against Harry and Meghan, he articulated something that has been quietly building beneath the surface of royal reporting for years. His observation wasn't just another addition to the endless commentary cycle. It was a moment of clarity that cuts through the manufactured outrage and forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about how institutions protect themselves through narrative control. To understand what O'Brien was really getting at, we need to examine not just what's being said about Harry and Meghan's Australia trip, but why the reaction has been so disproportionately intense, and what that intensity reveals about the actual power dynamics at play. On the surface, Harry and Meghan's planned business trip to Australia should be unremarkable. Entrepreneurs, founders, and global brand builders take such trips constantly. They're ordinary occurrences in the business world, opportunities to meet with partners, explore ventures, strengthen relationships with audiences and collaborators. Yet the response from significant portions of the British media and the reverberations from royal circles have been nothing short of intense, wildly overblown, and at times genuinely hostile. This disproportionate reaction is the key to understanding what's actually being threatened. If this were simply another couple travelling for work purposes, if it were truly just business as usual, there would be no story worth telling. There wouldn't be outrage manufactured across tabloids and broadcasters. There wouldn't be panels assembled to dissect their motives and speculate endlessly about their intentions. The sheer ferocity of the reaction reveals that this isn't fundamentally about a trip at all. It's about what that trip represents: independence operating completely outside the control of the palace and beyond the reach of traditional royal reporting structures that have gate-kept narratives for centuries. What makes Harry and Meghan's situation so threatening to the establishment isn't that they're breaking laws or violating sacred traditions, it's that they're proving something far more dangerous, that you don't actually need the institution to succeed. They've transformed from subjects of royal coverage into business owners with real ventures, genuine partnerships, global audiences, and influence that operates independently of any royal sanction or approval. They're not waiting for permission from Buckingham Palace to take their next step. They're not relying on royal reporters to validate their relevance or define their worth. They're certainly not playing by the old rules that kept previous generations of royals in carefully constructed boxes. This creates a genuine problem for the entire ecosystem that once revolved around them and profited from their presence. The fundamental question becomes, what happens when the subjects of relentless coverage no longer need that coverage to succeed? What happens when the traditional gatekeepers suddenly lose their access and their power to shape the narrative? That's where the tension starts showing in unmistakable ways, and that's precisely where O'Brien's criticism becomes so cutting. The palace has historically relied on three things to maintain its position and power: access, hierarchy, and meticulously managed narratives where the institution dictates the story and the media faithfully reproduces it. When Harry and Meghan broke away, they didn't just leave the institution. They dismantled the entire structure that gave traditional media its power to define them. And that loss of control is what's driving the relentless scrutiny. Understanding the media's frustration requires examining what's actually changed in their relationship with Harry and Meghan. There are three very specific and undeniable realities that have completely shifted the power dynamic, and all of them sting for traditional outlets that once controlled the narrative. First, they're no longer invited into the inner workings of Harry and Meghan's world. There are no exclusive briefings anymore, no behind-the-scenes access that keeps journalists feeling important and informed, no carefully orchestrated leaks that feed the endless news cycle that benefits everyone in the traditional media ecosystem. This loss of access is particularly painful because it removes the mechanism through which the palace once controlled coverage. By selectively briefing certain reporters and outlets, they could shape which stories got told and how they were framed. Second, and this one really stings, traditional media outlets don't have concrete, reliable information about what Harry and Meghan are actually building. They don't know the specifics of business moves, who their partners are, or what their strategy looks like, because it's all happening outside the usual channels where journalists have traditionally gotten their scoops and maintained their relevance. That information vacuum is absolutely devastating to traditional media because it's where speculation doesn't just flourish, it takes over completely. Without real facts to anchor narratives, stories become increasingly fragile and easily dismantled. Third, when narratives are constructed without solid grounding, when stories are built on half-truths, assumptions, and wishful thinking about what Harry and Meghan are supposedly doing, those narratives simply don't hold up under scrutiny. They collapse, they fragment, and when that happens repeatedly, it doesn't just damage credibility. It creates genuine frustration and reveals the media's dependence on access and cooperation. This is crucial because it explains why coverage has become increasingly hostile. Outlets are essentially being forced to either speculate without facts or admit they simply don't know what's happening. Neither option is acceptable to institutions built on the assumption of their own authority and knowledge. But beyond these structural issues, there's something more profoundly personal driving this hostility. For many observers in the establishment, this isn't just about media dynamics or information access. It's fundamentally about comparison, and comparison within the context of the royal family has always been something quietly managed by the institution until the dynamics became impossible to control. From the moment Meghan entered the royal sphere, she brought with her a completely different kind of presence, an undeniable energy, and a skill set that extended far beyond what the monarchy traditionally expected from its women. She was media-savvy in ways that weren't comfortable, globally recognised in a manner that didn't fit neatly into the prescribed royal hierarchy, and deeply comfortable in spaces that extended far beyond the boundaries of traditional royal duties and ceremonial appearances. She fundamentally changed the dynamic in ways that made powerful people uncomfortable. There's been a persistent narrative circulating in palace circles and sympathetic media that Meghan, in particular, disrupted expectations in ways that weren't supposed to happen. She didn't simply blend in and disappear into the machinery of royalty. She didn't follow along quietly and accept predefined limitations. She didn't restrict herself to the narrow roles that women in the royal family are traditionally confined to. Instead, she made an immediate impact that shifted attention and challenged the established order. That's where the comparison started, between her and Kate Middleton, between Harry and Prince William. And whether one agrees with those comparisons or not, the mere perception of them was enough to create deep tension within the institution. The structure of a hereditary monarchy depends entirely on order, on roles being clearly defined and rigidly adhered to, on people knowing their place and staying there. You're not supposed to outshine the system or challenge its logic. You're not supposed to redefine what's possible within it. And you're absolutely not supposed to walk away from it and then succeed on your own terms, which is precisely what happened. When the hierarchy that a centuries-old institution depends on begins to crack, the reaction is inevitably defensive. The system that once seemed permanent and immutable suddenly appears vulnerable, and that vulnerability generates panic among those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. So, when Harry and Meghan announce something like a self-funded international business trip that highlights their autonomy, showcases their entrepreneurial interests, and demonstrates their continued global relevance independent of royal blessing, it doesn't register as just another trip. It looks and feels like proof, irrefutable proof, that they can operate, thrive, build, and expand without the institution that once defined them. And that's where the real discomfort crystallizes, because it raises an even more difficult question that keeps establishment figures awake at night. If they can do all of this independently and successfully, what does that say about the actual necessity of the system they decided to leave behind? This is the existential threat that the palace cannot afford to acknowledge. Its entire legitimacy rests on the assumption that relevance flows downward from the crown, that access is a commodity controlled by the institution, and that anyone operating within the royal sphere remains fundamentally dependent on its approval and its machinery. But Harry and Meghan proved something deeply uncomfortable. The system isn't actually necessary. Their success exists completely independently of royal sanction, royal protection, or royal association. That's not just a business accomplishment, it's an existential threat to an institution that has spent generations convincing everyone, including itself, that it's indispensable. And institutions facing existential threats don't respond with measured analysis. They respond with defensive aggression, with narrative warfare, with the deployment of every tool at their disposal to delegitimize the threat and reassert their control. This is precisely where James O'Brien's criticism cuts through all the manufactured noise with devastating clarity. His observation that the palace, whether acting directly or indirectly, becomes complicit in narratives that seek to undermine rather than acknowledge that independence isn't just controversial. It's profoundly revealing because it exposes how institutions actually protect themselves in the modern era. Institutions don't protect themselves purely through structure and tradition. They protect themselves through storytelling, through narrative control, through the careful cultivation of how the public perceives them. And when a narrative emerges that challenges the institution's relevance or necessity, there's invariably a coordinated push to counter it, to reframe it, to diminish it, and make it seem less significant than it actually is. This is where the strategy becomes problematic. That defensive approach only works when the audience accepts the narrative at face value. And increasingly, more and more people are questioning these carefully constructed stories because they're asking themselves serious questions. What is the actual end goal here? What is the real purpose of consistently framing Harry and Meghan's actions in a negative light, especially when those actions, like planning a business trip, are fundamentally ordinary in literally any other context? Why does success that exists outside the royal framework trigger such a disproportionately strong reaction? Why does independence seem to provoke significantly more scrutiny and hostility than dependency ever did? And perhaps most crucially, who actually benefits from this relentless scrutiny and negative coverage? Because it's not just about getting headlines anymore. There's a growing and legitimate concern about the tone, about the intensity, about where exactly the line gets drawn between criticism and something far more troubling and sustained. When coverage starts to feel less like analysis and more like targeting, when it takes on a character that feels personal rather than journalistic, people notice and they remember. When narratives consistently suggest that a couple pursuing their own path is somehow threatening to national interests or social order, people rightfully question those implications. And when the volume and relentless consistency of that coverage reaches a certain pitch and intensity, it raises serious and unavoidable concerns about what the actual intent and motivation really is. This is where many thoughtful observers are going further and suggesting that this isn't simply about disagreement or legitimate critique. There's an underlying hostility that feels deeply disproportionate to the actual situation. That's a serious claim that shouldn't be made or received lightly, but the fact that it's being voiced and discussed at all speaks volumes about how this entire situation is being perceived by people who are paying attention. At its absolute core, this isn't just a story about an international business trip, it's a story about control versus independence. It's about who gets to define what success actually looks like. It's about whether stepping away from a centuries-old institution is seen as liberation or as defiance. And it's fundamentally about how systems react when individuals prove definitively that they don't need those systems to thrive. Harry and Meghan's entire journey has become a case study in exactly that kind of reaction. They were expected to follow a carefully written script, but they chose to write their own story instead. They were expected to remain locked within a rigid structure, but they built something entirely outside of it. And now every single move they make is analysed and interpreted through that lens of threat and disruption. So when they plan a straightforward business trip to Australia, it's not treated as business. It's treated as a statement, as a challenge, as a disruption to the natural order. But maybe it's actually much simpler than all of that. Maybe it's exactly what it looks like at face value. Two people building a life, constructing a brand, and developing a global presence entirely on their own terms, without asking permission from anyone. The broader significance of what O'Brien articulated extends far beyond Harry and Meghan themselves. What he was really describing is how institutions respond to challenges to their authority, how they deploy narrative power to maintain control, and how the loss of that control generates the kind of hostility we're witnessing. This pattern isn't unique to the royal family. It's visible across many traditional institutions facing disruption from individuals or groups who found ways to operate outside their frameworks. The response is predictable. Initial dismissal, then increasing hostility, then attempts to delegitimize through narrative control. When those tactics fail, when the individuals or groups continue to succeed despite the negative coverage, institutions often escalate, becoming more aggressive in their narrative warfare. What makes the Harry and Meghan situation particularly significant is that it's playing out in real time, with audiences increasingly able to see through the manufactured narratives and recognize the institutional panic beneath them. People are asking themselves why a couple's business decisions generate more scrutiny than many major political or corporate decisions. They're noticing the disproportionality, and that notice itself represents a crack in the institution's narrative control. Ultimately, James O'Brien's criticism forces us to confront the most uncomfortable question of all. Why does their success make certain institutions so uncomfortable? Why is their independence treated as a threat? Why are they subjected to a level of scrutiny that seems designed less to inform the public and more to delegitimize them? The answers to these questions reveal far more about the institutions asking them than they do about Harry and Meghan. They reveal institutions struggling to maintain relevance and control in a world where traditional gatekeeping power is rapidly eroding. They reveal systems built on assumptions of necessity that are increasingly being proven false. And they reveal how institutions respond when confronted with that fundamental threat. Not with grace or acknowledgement, but with defensive aggression and narrative warfare. The real story here isn't about Harry and Meghan's Australia trip. It's about what happens when individuals prove they don't need the systems that once defined them, and how those systems fight back. And in that broader story lies a crucial lesson about power, control, and what happens when institutions face the one challenge they were never designed to handle: irrelevance.